It's a story of young love gone wrong, of anger, betrayal, and murder, of twisted metal and shattered glass, of two young men gone and a 17-year-old girl in prison. This is the case of Mackenzie Shirilla. Mackenzie Shirilla had been in a relationship with Dominique Rousseau for 3 or 4 years. Rousseau was 20, 3 years older than Shirilla, and he came from a large family. He had 6 siblings. According to prosecutors, Shirilla had lived with Rousseau at his home for most of the time the couple dated. But at some point before July 31st, 2022, the relationship between Shirilla and Rousseau turned toxic. According to prosecutors, Shirilla made multiple threats toward Rousseau. She even told him, "I will crash this car right now." On July 19, 2022, Shirilla allegedly broke into the Columbia Church of God. She was charged with breaking and entering, vandalism, and desecration. During that next week, prosecutors say she made plans to crash her car to kill Dominique Rousseau. She even drove by the building, scoping out where she ultimately would crash her car. In the evening of July 30th, 2022, Shirilla hung out at a friend's house with Rousseau and their good friend, Davian Flanagan. Flanagan was 19 years old, and he had graduated from Strongsville High School just 2 months earlier with Mackenzie. The three smoked pot together. Shirilla also was charged with possession of magic mushrooms, but we don't know whether she took any that evening. Davian Flanagan asked for a ride home, a minor request with tragic consequences. Prosecutors presented evidence that Shirilla was over the Ohio legal limit for THC when she took the wheel to drive the threesome home in the early morning hours of July 31st, 2022. Dominique Rousseau climbed in the passenger seat beside her. Flanagan hopped in the back seat. One of the prosecutors would say Davian was just cargo. He was just a suitcase in the back seat in the defendant's mind. Shirilla drove through an industrial park she had scouted out earlier. Surveillance video from nearby buildings showed her driving at a leisurely pace until she hit the straightaway toward a particular building. At 5:30 a.m., video shows she accelerated wildly and drove her Toyota Camry directly into the side of a brick wall of a building, going 100 miles per hour. Prosecutors say the crash was intentional. Shirilla wanted to kill her boyfriend Rousseau. Flanagan, unfortunately, was literally along for the ride. The crash was horrific. When police arrived at the scene, Shirilla, Rousseau, and Flanagan all were unconscious, not breathing, and trapped in the vehicle. Shirilla was pulled out and airlifted to a hospital, miraculously still alive. But both Rousseau and Flanagan were pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators found Shirilla's Prada slippers still on the accelerator. Hallucinogenic mushrooms and a scale were found near her at the scene. The footage of the car accelerating was overwhelming. In investigating the crash, prosecutors put together surveillance footage showing Shirilla's Toyota Camry accelerating toward the wall of a commercial building, and the judge called that evidence chilling and tragic.
I will say again, if any reasonable person reviews Exhibit 802, there can be no doubt in your mind what happened this night.
Prosecutors pointed out how little Shirilla seemed to care about what she had done. Prosecutors referred to her shocking lack of remorse. While she was still in the hospital recovering from the wreck herself, she tried to get a modeling job from a Los Angeles agency. During her interrogation, she asked, "Can't you take away my license for 10 years or something like that?" In the end, she got her wish plus some. A chilling video was posted to her TikTok, presumably by Shirilla herself. She smiles archly and says she can't die, and then shows the crashed car and says RIP to the two young men.
I'm not even cool. I'm just one of those girls that can do a lot of drugs and not die.
She's very young, but at the least, the video was in terrible taste and sent the wrong message about how seriously she was taking what had happened. Prosecutors also introduced photos of Shirilla seemingly enjoying herself after the wreck. One showed her at a concert in a wheelchair. Another showed her dressed as a corpse on Halloween. Again, the photo sent a terrible message about her remorse for the accident. Rousseau's brother spoke at Shirilla's sentencing hearing. He called Mackenzie Shirilla the most selfish person I know. She was driving, going to concerts, dressing up for Halloween with no thought of the lives she had destroyed. Shirilla was charged with 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of vehicular homicide, drug possession, and possessing criminal tools. In an unusual move, the defense agreed to try the case to a judge instead of a jury. It didn't help. The judge found Shirilla guilty on all counts. At trial and sentencing, Shirilla maintained that the wreck had merely been a terrible accident and that she had not crashed her car on purpose. The judge clearly wasn't buying it.
The defendant controlled all the events. She chose the day. Specifically, she chose a day just before her 18th birthday. She chose to drive the car, the time to drive the car. She chose an obscure, previously scouted route through an industrial parkway. She chose the target to hit and the victims. She chose the means and the method to follow through. And she planned and purposefully executed the events of July 31st, 2022.
Shirilla claimed not to be able to remember the crash. Her mother testified that Shirilla had been diagnosed with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, which could cause her to pass out if her sodium and hydration levels dropped too low. Shirilla's lawyer argued that her medical condition had caused her to lose control of the car and that she did not accelerate into the wall on purpose. The lawyer's argument was seriously undercut by the fact that Shirilla had continued to drive after the wreck, despite the claim that she had a medical condition that could cause her to black out. The judge did not believe that Shirilla had any medical condition.
The review of the evidence supports the factual findings, the forensic testimony, the testimony of the first responders, the testimony of the emergency room doctors who treated the defendant, the testimony of the coroner's medical examiner, the testimony of those who knew the victims and the defendant, and the testimony of the BMV official who provided evidence that not only did the defendant deny any medical condition when applying for her license, which her mother co-signed and attested to, but also that just after the accident, Mackenzie renewed her driver's license and again denied any medical condition. In fact, the defendant was so concerned about driving that, as the state mentioned, during the investigation, she asked if they could just suspend her license for 10 years. It is hard to fathom how a person could be concerned about their driving privileges, having just been responsible for the deaths of 2 people. There was no medical condition that caused this as an accident. There was no mechanical failure of the car. The record is clear on the facts and the evidence. Her mother's uncorroborated statements without any medical testimony or records is not persuasive.
At sentencing, Shirilla said,
"I'm so deeply sorry. I hope one day you can see I would never let this happen or do it on purpose."
She told the families,
"I wish I could remember what happened. I'm just so sorry. I'm heartbroken. I love Don and Davion. We were all friends, and Don was my soulmate. I wish I could take all your pain away, and I'm so sorry."
The judge insisted this was not reckless driving. This was murder. She had a mission, and she executed it with precision. The mission was death. The judge pointed out how the 2 victims must have felt as the car careened toward the wall. The judge said there can be no doubt as to the absolute terror of the 2 people in that car. The judge acknowledged that Mackenzie may have intended to die in the accident too.
It is also important to remember that even if Mackenzie intended to also die in this crash, that is irrelevant. A failed suicide attempt is not a defense to murder. And even in a murder-suicide attempt, when the perpetrator executing the plan survives, the other death or deaths are still murder.
You may be wondering why, from a legal perspective, the judge said that. Ohio Code Section 2903.01 sets out the conditions for finding someone guilty of aggravated murder. It says that no person shall purposely and with prior calculation and design cause the death of another or the unlawful termination of another's pregnancy. So the question for the court was to decide whether Shirilla purposely and with prior calculation intended to cause the death of the two young men in the car with her. It was legally irrelevant whether she also wanted to cause her own death. The question was what her intention was as to the two passengers in the car. The automatic minimum sentence for Shirilla was 15 years to life. Since Shirilla was charged with murdering two people, those two sentences could have been served consecutively, which would stretch the minimum to 15 per victim or 30 years as a minimum. The judge said,
The difficulty for sentencing today, honestly, is whether or not I believe you should get consecutive sentences.
in a show of mercy, the court allowed the sentences to run concurrently. In 15 years, Shirilla will have the option for parole. Mackenzie also had her driver's license permanently suspended. The judge acknowledged that the families of the two victims might not agree with her decision to give Shirilla a lighter sentence than she could have received.
I understand that the pain in this room wants me to impose the harshest sentence, but I don't believe that would be the appropriate sentence because I do believe that Mackenzie will not be out in 15 years.
And in fact, some of the family members of the victims showed beautiful and heartbreaking compassion for Shirilla. Despite his grief, Dominique Rousseau's dad said he did not want Shirilla to have to spend her entire life in prison. He said, "It's horrible for everybody. Yeah, I lost my son. It's harder on our family. But I don't want the rest of her life ruined too. It isn't going to make me feel any better." And of course, as the judge noted, the fact that Mackenzie will be eligible for parole in 15 years is not the same as receiving parole.
There's a very good likelihood, Mackenzie, that you will spend the rest of your life in prison. That won't be up to me. That will be up to the parole board, and that will be up to you to a great extent.
Most prisoners are not granted parole on the first try, but Mackenzie Shirilla was given at least that shred of hope. Please subscribe for more great and understandable content about the cases everybody's talking about, and please hit that like button. I'd love to see you in the next video.